The training field was alive with the restless energy of young soldiers and seasoned veterans, each one carrying the weight of expectation on their shoulders, but none more so than the lone woman standing at the far end of the firing range, her dark hair tied back beneath a standard-issue cap, her rifle cradled in her arms like an extension of her body. She had been called many things since arriving at the Special Operations Camp: the token, the experiment, and most often, the mistake, because no one in that unit truly believed she belonged there. The Navy SEALs, men who had carved their reputations in firefights across deserts and jungles, carried themselves with an almost arrogant confidence that came from surviving death more times than they could count. To them, she was a novelty at best and a liability at worst, and when the commanding officer announced a precision test against moving targets at extended range, the mocking started almost instantly. "No one can hit that," barked Lieutenant Harris, a man built like iron with a voice sharp enough to cut glass, his disdain dripping with every syllable. The others laughed, some with open derision, some with subtle smirks, but all united in disbelief that she, a so-called simple woman who had barely spoken since arriving, would even dare take the shot. Yet she stood silent, her boots steady on the packed earth, her breathing measured as though the laughter around her didn't even exist. What they didn't know, and what she would never have volunteered, was that her life had been a crucible of silence and patience, honed not in sterile ranges but in the raw, unforgiving landscapes of war where missing a single shot meant not embarrassment but death. She remembered the cold nights on the border of her homeland, the way the rifle felt against her cheek as she lay motionless for hours waiting for the slightest movement in the distance, her heartbeat slower than the ticking of a clock, her eyes trained to separate shadows from silhouettes. Those memories came flooding back now, not as weight but as fuel, an invisible anchor grounding her against the storm of ridicule. The test was brutal, a steel silhouette mounted on a track half a mile away, darting unpredictably left and right, its speed mimicking the erratic sprint of a fleeing target. Even the most seasoned marksmen struggled with it, and most had burned through magazines of ammunition without landing a clean hit. Harris had tried himself and failed spectacularly, his bullets kicking up dust clouds a good 6 feet off target, though no one dared point that out aloud. Instead, they laughed it off as a flawed setup, and when the commanding officer invited the woman to try, Harris smirked and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "This should be good. Maybe she can knit a sweater for the target instead." The laughter rolled again, crude and dismissive, but she did not flinch. She dropped to one knee, checked her sights with deliberate calm, and adjusted the windage dial by instinct, her eyes narrowing as she tracked the rhythm of the target's movement. Her mind went quiet, the world shrinking until there was nothing but her, the rifle, and the fleeting shape dancing in the distance. She knew the key wasn't to chase the target but to predict it, to feel its rhythm the way a hunter feels the breath of prey before the pounce. Slowly, steadily she inhaled, letting her lungs fill, then paused at the peak, her finger tightening on the trigger with a smoothness that betrayed years of practice. The rifle cracked, the sound slicing through the range like thunder, and a split second later the metallic clang of impact echoed back across the field. Dead center. For a heartbeat the entire camp went silent, the laughter dying on open lips, the disbelief painted across hardened faces. The target had staggered on its rail, the fresh hole in its steel chest proof that the impossible had just been done. Harris blinked, his smirk collapsing into something halfway between anger and confusion, while the commanding officer, usually stone-faced, let the barest trace of a smile flicker at the corner of his mouth. But she wasn't done. She chambered another round, recalibrated by a hair's breadth, and squeezed again. Another clang, this time clipping the target as it shifted left. A third shot followed, then a fourth, each one connecting in succession, the cadence of her fire a symphony of discipline and precision. By the time her magazine was empty, the once pristine steel plate looked as though it had been chewed by fire. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ringing of hot brass on the ground. She stood, brushed the dust from her knee, and without so much as a glance at the stunned faces around her, slung the rifle across her shoulder and walked back toward the line of trainees. No triumphant grin, no boast, just the same calm expression she had worn when she began. The men shifted uneasily, their arrogance deflated, and Harris, red-faced and furious, muttered under his breath but offered no further challenge. In that moment, unspoken yet undeniable, she had shifted the balance of respect. She had walked onto that range mocked as a joke, but by sunset, every man there knew the truth, that she was no token, no mistake, but a force sharpened by battles they could not even imagine. The night after the demonstration, the camp was quieter than usual, as though the echoes of her shots still lingered in the air, haunting the pride of every man who had doubted her. Around the barracks, the usual banter and raucous laughter softened, their conversations reduced to murmurs when she walked past, some out of shame, others out of grudging acknowledgement. She had not sought their approval, but in the world of soldiers, respect was a currency forged not from words but from deeds, and hers had been written in steel and smoke. Yet even as she polished her rifle in the dim light of her bunk, she knew this was only the beginning. A single performance, no matter how flawless, could not erase years of ingrained prejudice. The SEALs were men who had earned their reputations in blood-soaked operations far from home, and to them respect wasn't gifted, it was tested again and again until it burned into permanence. She expected the whispers, the sidelong glances, the quiet conversations cut short whenever she entered a room, but what she didn't expect was the sudden challenge that arrived the very next morning. Lieutenant Harris, still seething from his humiliation, gathered a group at the obstacle course just after dawn and made certain she was present. He spoke loudly, his tone laced with scorn. A single lucky shot doesn't make a soldier. Out here, you need stamina, grit, and the kind of strength that doesn't come from hiding behind a scope. His words carried, and soon the others gathered, eager to witness what they thought would be her undoing. The obstacle course was infamous. A brutal circuit of walls, ropes, mud pits, and balance beams, designed to strip every ounce of strength from those who dared run it. Most men barely finished within the time limit, collapsing in the dirt as their muscles screamed for mercy. Harris, tall and broad-shouldered, had dominated it before, his power and endurance setting the bar high. Now he smirked, his arms folded as he barked. "You think you belong here? Then prove it. Run this course, beat my time, and maybe, just maybe, I'll believe you're more than a fluke." She met his stare without blinking, her face unreadable. A hush fell over the crowd, the kind of silence that swelled before a storm, and then she stepped forward without a word, tightening her boots and squaring her shoulders. The whistle blew and she was off. The first wall loomed ahead, 10 feet high and slick with dew, but she attacked it with practiced efficiency, using momentum and leverage rather than brute force. Her hands found holds, her legs pushed upward, and within seconds she swung herself over, landing lightly on the other side. The men exchanged glances, their smirks fading as she moved swiftly to the rope climb. Harris's strength had always allowed him to muscle his way up, but she used rhythm and balance, wrapping her legs to conserve energy, her arms pulling with measured precision. She reached the top and slid down with speed, her breath steady, her eyes sharp. Mud pits swallowed her boots, balance beams tested her focus, and barbed wire forced her to crawl belly flat through gravel and muck, yet through it all she never faltered. Her body was not built like Harris's, but she had something different. Endurance honed by years of survival, by days spent on mountainsides carrying gear heavier than her frame, by nights when sleep was impossible and hunger gnawed but duty kept her moving. Each obstacle she cleared was another reminder that strength was not just in muscle but in will, in the refusal to yield. By the time she reached the final sprint, the crowd that had gathered no longer jeered. They were silent, watching as her boots pounded the dirt, her arms pumping, her eyes locked forward. She crossed the finish line, her chest rising and falling with sharp breaths, but not collapsing, not broken. The stopwatch clicked, and the officer overseeing the course raised his brows. She had not only completed it, she had beaten Harris's time by a full 8 seconds. Gasps rippled through the men, disbelief etched on their faces, but the truth was undeniable. Harris's jaw clenched, his fists curling at his sides, but there was no excuse left to cling to. She had done what he had challenged and she had done it better. Sweat dripped down her temples, mixing with the dirt streaked across her skin, yet her expression remained calm, almost indifferent, as though victory meant nothing to her. In truth it didn't. For her, this wasn't about Harris or even the men around her. It was about proving to herself more than anyone, that she could endure, that she could push past the walls others set before her. The crowd began to shift, their silence breaking into murmurs, not of derision this time but of respect, grudging but growing. For the first time, they looked at her not as a token, not as an outsider but as one of them. Harris stormed off without a word, his pride wounded deeper than any bullet could pierce, but she paid him no mind. As she wiped her hands clean and rejoined the line of soldiers, she knew the path ahead was still steep. One victory on the range, one triumph on the course. These were steps, not the summit. Yet with each step, the walls around her cracked, and through those cracks, the light of recognition began to shine. By sunset, she was no longer just the woman they mocked. She was the soldier they could not ignore. Days passed after the obstacle course, and the atmosphere in camp shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Where once the sound of mocking laughter had followed her like a shadow, now there was silence, sometimes even nods of acknowledgement from men who had previously dismissed her existence. It was not yet full acceptance, she could still feel the weight of doubt in their eyes, but respect, that rarest of currencies among warriors, was beginning to circulate in her favor. Still, Harris remained a thorn, his pride bruised beyond repair, and his resentment smoldered like a coal that refused to die. He began to test her in small ways, assigning her extra gear during marches, insisting she take point during night patrols, even tampering with her rations under the guise of discipline. Yet to his frustration she never broke. She carried the extra weight without complaint, moved through the dark with eyes sharp as a hawk's, and ate whatever little was left on her tray with calm acceptance. Every attempt to see her stumble only deepened the quiet admiration of those around her, until even the whispers began to favor her resilience over his hostility. But true acceptance in a soldier's world does not come from drills or games. It comes in the crucible of combat, where life and death balance on the edge of a trigger. That test came sooner than anyone expected. A mission order arrived at dawn, stamped with urgency, and within hours the unit was moving, their destination a remote village pinned between jagged hills and endless desert. Intelligence suggested hostile fighters had taken control, using civilians as cover while preparing an ambush against coalition convoys. The assignment was clear: move in, confirm, and neutralize the threat. For many of the SEALs it was routine, but for her, it was the first true chance to prove that her skills were not confined to the range or the course but were weapons forged for the field. As the convoy rolled out, the sun burned overhead, the air shimmering with heat, dust choking every breath. She rode silently, her rifle across her lap, her mind already building maps of the terrain. Every rise in the land, every shadowed ridge, every gap between buildings, she noted it all, her instincts sharpening as they neared the village. Harris, still fuming from his defeats, sat across from her, his jaw tight, his eyes hard, but he said nothing, though the contempt radiated from him like heat from steel. The mission began quietly enough. The team dismounted, moved into the outskirts, securing positions with practiced efficiency. Civilians scattered at the sight of them, vanishing into homes or fleeing down alleys. The tension thickened, heavy with the scent of impending violence, and then it came, gunfire erupting from rooftops, sharp cracks splitting the air as dust kicked up around their boots. The ambush had been real and it was merciless. Men shouted orders, returning fire, scattering to cover as the world exploded into chaos. She moved without hesitation, sliding behind a crumbled wall, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the rooftops. Her training dissolved into instinct, her breathing steady despite the storm around her. She spotted the glint of a rifle barrel, the twitch of movement, and in a single heartbeat she was prone, her scope aligned, her fingers squeezing. The shot rang and a hostile crumpled from the rooftop, tumbling like a rag doll. Another target appeared, darting between shadows, but she tracked him with unerring calm, firing once, twice, and silence followed as his body stilled. Around her the SEALs noticed. They had seen snipers before, men who required minutes to line up a shot, who missed under pressure. She, however, was relentless, each shot precise, each movement fluid, her discipline cutting through the chaos like a blade. The tide of the ambush began to shift. Harris, pinned behind a broken cart, barked into his radio for support, but his voice carried an edge of panic. He leaned out to return fire, only to freeze as a hostile fighter lined him up from a rooftop. It would have been his end, clean and brutal, had her scope not already found the threat. The crack of her rifle split the air, and the man above Harris fell, his rifle clattering onto the tiles. Harris looked up, stunned, his expression caught between anger and disbelief. She had saved him, though he would never admit it aloud. The firefight dragged on for long minutes, but with each passing second her precision carved away at the ambushers' numbers, her calm under fire anchoring the team in ways none had expected. When the last hostile fell and silence reclaimed the village, the SEALs regrouped, sweat streaking their faces, their breaths heavy. Eyes turned to her, not with mockery, not with doubt, but with something closer to reverence. She had not just proven herself, she had changed the course of the fight. Harris said nothing, his lips pressed into a thin line, his pride shattered yet again, but even his silence could not erase what had happened. They all knew the truth now. The woman they had mocked, the one they had dismissed as a mistake, was the reason they were standing alive under the blistering sun. For her it was not victory nor vindication. It was simply duty fulfilled. She cleaned her rifle, checked her gear, and when the commanding officer gave the order to move out, she fell in line without a word. But deep inside she knew that the battle for respect was no longer hers to fight. It had already been won, written not in arguments or boasts but in blood, in bullets, and in the silence that followed the storm. The convoy moved out from the village under the weight of exhaustion, but also under the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just transpired. The desert stretched before them, endless waves of heat shimmering like illusions, the silence broken only by the growl of engines and the occasional crackle of the radio. She sat in the rear of one vehicle, her rifle resting across her knees, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Around her, the men shifted uncomfortably, sneaking glances at her when they thought she wouldn't notice. Their eyes no longer carried mockery, nor the disbelief of before, but something harder to define, something between respect and unease. She had saved them, proved herself in the crucible of fire, yet there was a weight in their silence, as though they now questioned not her place among them, but their own measure beside her. Harris, sitting opposite her, avoided her gaze entirely, his face drawn, his pride hollowed out. He had been spared by her bullet, his life preserved by the very hands he had tried to break, and though gratitude flickered somewhere deep in him, his ego strangled it before it could surface. To thank her would be to admit weakness, to confess that the woman he mocked had done what he could not, and that truth was poison to him. The ride dragged on, the sun climbing higher, sweat soaking their uniforms, until the radio sparked alive with new orders. Intelligence had intercepted chatter. A second ambush was being prepared ahead, larger, better coordinated, waiting in the canyons that carved through the land like scars. The convoy slowed, caution weighing on every movement. The officer ordered a halt, and the men dismounted to scout the ridges before walking blindly into another trap. It was here, on the jagged rocks overlooking the canyon, that her skill became indispensable. She moved ahead of the others, climbing with the agility of someone who had spent years on unforgiving terrain, her rifle strapped across her back, her eyes sweeping the ridgelines. Every stone, every shadow, every bird that rose startled from the cliffs told her a story. To the untrained eye, the canyon seemed empty, silent but for the whisper of the wind, yet to her, the signs were clear. A glint too sharp for sunlight alone, a rock disturbed where no animal tread, the faint outline of a barrel half concealed beneath fabric. She saw them all, the ambushers lying in wait like wolves in tall grass. She raised her hand, signaling to the team behind her, and pointed toward the ridges. Harris squinted but saw nothing, his frustration deepening as he muttered, "She's imagining things." But the officer trusted her now. He ordered silence, patience, and when she settled into a prone position, scope trained on the cliffs, the rest followed her lead. Minutes dragged into eternity, sweat dripping into their eyes, muscles stiff from stillness. Then, as if summoned by her certainty, the ambushers revealed themselves, creeping into position, their rifles glinting as they readied the kill. She did not hesitate. Her rifle cracked, the echo bouncing through the canyon, and one hostile slumped before he could raise his weapon. Chaos erupted, the enemy shouting in surprise, scrambling to return fire, their ambush unraveled before it began. The seals opened up, the canyon exploding with gunfire, but it was her precision that carved the battle's rhythm. Each shot found its mark, cutting down leaders before they could rally, silencing threats before they could strike. Harris fought hard, but even as he squeezed rounds from his rifle, he knew he was only adding noise to her music, the symphony of steel that dictated victory. The fight raged for long minutes, echoes booming off the canyon walls, until the last hostile fell and silence reclaimed the cliffs. The team exhaled in unison, relief mingling with awe, their eyes again drifting toward the woman who had seen what none of them could, who had dismantled a trap before it could close around their throats. The officer approached her, his usually stony expression softened by something close to admiration. "Good work," he said simply, the highest praise he ever offered. She nodded once, expression calm, though inside she felt a flicker of something rare, acceptance. Harris, however, stood apart, his face dark, his hands shaking faintly as he reloaded his rifle. He could not deny what he had witnessed, yet denial was his only shield. To admit her worth would mean confronting his own weakness, and that was a battle he could not fight. That night, when the camp settled near the canyon floor, the men gathered in small groups, recounting the battle in low voices. For the first time, her name was spoken with respect, woven into their stories not as a token but as a cornerstone. Some even approached her, offering quiet words of acknowledgement, a rare gesture among men trained to bury emotion. She listened, nodded, but never sought their praise. For her, each fight was the same, a duty, a necessity, nothing more. As the stars wheeled overhead, bright and countless in the desert sky, she lay awake, her rifle by her side, her eyes tracing constellations she remembered from childhood. She thought of the people she had once protected, the lives she had saved and the lives she had taken, each one etched into her soul like scars invisible to the eye. Here, among men who had mocked her, she was finally carving a place not through words, not through anger but through the quiet power of deeds. Yet she also knew that battles still lay ahead, not only against enemies waiting in shadows, but against the doubts and resentments festering within her own ranks. Respect, she had learned long ago, was not won once and held forever. It was tested daily in every shot, every step, every breath taken under the weight of duty. And she was ready. The following weeks tested the unit in ways none of them had anticipated. Missions blurred together, long marches through scorching deserts, tense patrols in villages where every window might conceal a rifle, nights spent in silence broken only by the distant echo of gunfire. Through it all, she carried herself with the same calm steadiness that had come to define her. The men who had once mocked her now watched her closely, not to laugh but to learn. They saw how she rationed her water with care, how she cleaned her weapon in darkness by touch alone, how she moved through unfamiliar terrain as though the land whispered its secrets directly to her. These were lessons not taught in manuals or drills but earned through a life lived on the edge of survival. Slowly, grudgingly, even the hardest skeptics began to shift. Yet Harris remained the exception. His pride had been wounded too many times, his authority undermined in ways he could neither forgive nor forget. He masked his bitterness behind cold silence, but it seeped out in the sharpness of his orders, the venom in his tone whenever he addressed her. Still, she endured, not rising to his bait, not seeking confrontation, because she knew her worth was no longer for him to decide. Then came the mission that would cement everything, the one that would etch her name into the memory of every man there. Orders arrived for a night raid on a fortified compound deep in hostile territory. Intelligence suggested high-value targets were inside, men responsible for orchestrating attacks that had taken countless lives. The task was dangerous, requiring stealth, precision, and nerves of steel. The team prepared in silence, checking weapons, adjusting gear, their faces set with grim determination. As they approached under cover of darkness, the compound loomed ahead, its walls rising like a shadow against the moonlit sky. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified, the crunch of boots on gravel, the whisper of wind through dry grass, the faint creak of gear. She moved at the rear, scanning the rooftops, her rifle ready. The plan was simple. Infiltrate, secure the targets, exfiltrate before reinforcements arrived. But plans rarely survived first contact. As the team breached the perimeter, silent and swift, a guard spotted them, his shout shattering the night. Gunfire erupted, chaos tearing through the air. The team scattered to cover, exchanging fire as the compound came alive with enemies. Harris led a group toward the main building, barking orders, but it was clear the element of surprise had been lost. She found a vantage point, scaling a low wall, her rifle braced as she scanned the battlefield. Hostiles swarmed from every doorway, their weapons flashing in the dark, but she was already lining up shots. One fell, then another, each round precise, her calm unwavering even as tracers cut the air around her. Through her scope, she spotted something critical. An enemy sniper perched high on a rooftop, his rifle trained on Harris's team as they pushed forward. Without hesitation, she shifted her aim, exhaled, and fired. The hostile collapsed, his shot never loosed, his body tumbling from the rooftop. Harris didn't even realize how close he had been to death, but the others saw, their respect deepening with every second she kept them alive. The fight raged on, brutal and unrelenting. Grenades shook the ground, the stench of smoke and cordite filling their lungs. She fired until her magazine emptied, reloaded with practiced speed, and continued, her focus absolute. When the team finally breached the main building, she followed, her steps light, her senses sharp. Inside, the rooms were a maze of shadows and gunfire, but she moved with quiet certainty, clearing corners, watching their backs. They found the targets, two men clutching weapons, cornered and desperate. Harris shouted for them to surrender, but one raised his rifle. Harris flinched, his shot going wide, but before the man could fire, her bullet ended it, swift and merciless. The second target dropped his weapon, hands raised, surrender written across his face. The mission was complete, though at a cost. The compound littered with bodies, the team bruised, bloodied, but alive. Outside, under the pale glow of the moon, the men regrouped, dragging themselves back to the extraction point. Harris stood apart, his shoulders tense, his pride eroded to dust. He could not deny what had happened, could not ignore the truth that once again she had been the deciding factor between life and death. When the helicopter lifted them into the night, the roar of its blades drowning thought. The men sat in silence, exhaustion etched on their faces. Yet beneath that exhaustion was something else, an unspoken acknowledgement, a bond forged in fire. For her there was no triumph, no smile of victory. She sat quietly, her rifle across her knees, her eyes fixed on the darkness below. She thought of the men she had killed, the lives she had ended, each one added to the invisible weight she carried. She did not revel in respect, did not crave glory. What she wanted was simpler, quieter, to prove that her presence was not a mistake, that her hands could carry the same burden as theirs. And in that night, with the compound burning behind them, she knew she had done exactly that. The morning after the raid, the camp was quieter than usual, but the silence was not born of weariness alone. It was the silence of men wrestling with truths too heavy to ignore. Around the mess tables, their conversations carried a new undertone, less brash, less careless, as though they had glimpsed something in her performance that unsettled their own confidence. For days they had watched her dismantle doubts with every shot, every step, every act of discipline, and though many now respected her, there was also a strange unease among them, a recognition that she had surpassed even their highest standards. Soldiers rarely admitted such things openly, but in their sidelong glances, in the sudden hush that fell whenever she entered, the truth was undeniable. She had proven herself not just their equal but, in many ways, their superior. Harris felt it most keenly, his pride cut deeper than any wound. In the solitude of his bunk, he replayed every moment where she had succeeded where he had failed, every time her bullets had saved the team while his had missed their mark. The bitterness gnawed at him, coiling tighter with each passing day until it threatened to consume what little respect he still commanded. His authority among the men had eroded, and though no one spoke it aloud, he could feel it slipping through his fingers. She meanwhile continued as she always had, quiet, disciplined, focused only on the next task. She never gloated, never sought recognition, never even acknowledged the stares of those around her. In her mind, victories were not trophies but responsibilities, each one tied to the weight of lives taken and lives saved. Yet the officer watching closely began to see in her something more, a rare steadiness, a presence that anchored the unit in chaos. He started assigning her more responsibility, subtle at first, then more direct. He asked her opinion during briefings, entrusted her with decisions in the field, and though some bristled at first, none could deny that her instincts were sharp, her judgment unflinching. Harris, seeing this, seethed. His resentment festered into open hostility. He challenged orders, questioned decisions, his words laced with venom every time he addressed her. Still, she endured, answering with calm precision, refusing to be drawn into his anger. Then came the mission that would bring everything to a head. Intelligence identified a high-value meeting deep within hostile mountains, leaders gathering to coordinate fresh waves of attacks. It was a strike that could cripple the enemy's momentum, but the risks were immense. The route was treacherous, the enemy entrenched, and the margin for error non-existent. The officer gathered the team, laying out the plan with grim detail. It would require stealth, endurance, and above all, precision. She listened, her eyes steady, already mapping the terrain in her mind. Harris sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his silence louder than words. The journey to the mountains was brutal. The air thinned as they climbed, their packs heavy, the path jagged and unforgiving. Every step tested their endurance, every breath a reminder of the thin line they walked between survival and collapse. Yet she moved with a quiet rhythm, her body remembering years spent on unforgiving hillsides, her lungs accustomed to thin air. She carried her rifle as though it were part of her, her eyes scanning ridgelines with unyielding focus. When they reached the overwatch position, the compound lay below them, lit faintly by the glow of fires, shadows moving like restless ghosts. The officer turned to her, his voice low but certain. "Your eyes, your call. We move when you say it's time." Harris stiffened, his anger barely restrained, but he said nothing. Through her scope, she studied the compound, noting sentries, the rhythm of patrols, the angles of light. Every detail fed into her calculation, every movement adding to the silent map she built in her mind. Minutes stretched into eternity until finally she whispered, "Now." The team moved, shadows within shadows, their boots silent on rock and soil. She covered them from above, her scope tracking every corner, every rooftop. Twice she fired, twice enemies fell before they could raise alarms, her bullets silent lightning in the night. The team breached, their movements swift, and the compound erupted into chaos. Harris led the charge inside, his frustration spilling into aggression, while she remained on overwatch, her calm guiding the storm. But then it happened, An enemy sniper revealed himself, hidden high on a distant ridge, his scope trained on Harris as he moved recklessly through the open. She saw it instantly, the faint glint, the shape too sharp against the skyline. Harris never noticed. In that heartbeat, she exhaled, her fingers squeezing, and the hostile collapsed before his shot could fly. Harris froze, the reality sinking in. Again she had saved him. Again his life had been hers to protect. When the fight ended, the compound lay silent, enemy leaders neutralized, the mission a success. The team regrouped, their breaths heavy, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt, but their eyes turned to her with something more than respect now, dependence. They knew, every one of them, that without her they would not have walked out alive. Harris stood apart, his face pale, his pride broken beyond repair. He said nothing, could say nothing because the truth had become too heavy to deny. She, as always, remained silent, her rifle slung across her shoulder, her eyes calm. For her, this was not victory, not vindication, but simply another night of duty. Yet as the team moved down the mountain under a fading moon, the bond between them had changed forever. She was no longer the outsider, no longer the subject of mockery. She was the anchor, the precision, the quiet force that held them together when chaos threatened to break them apart. The mountain raid had sealed her place among the unit, but with acceptance came a new kind of burden. The men no longer mocked her, no longer whispered doubts, but now they looked to her in moments when uncertainty gripped their throats. She had become a quiet pillar, the one whose steadiness they leaned on when the world cracked beneath their boots. It was a weight she carried without complaint, though inside she sometimes felt the heaviness of expectation pressing harder than the packs on her shoulders. Each mission they undertook seemed sharper, deadlier, the stakes climbing with every operation. The enemy, aware of their presence and stung by their losses, grew more desperate, more ruthless, setting traps meant not just to kill but to break their spirits. And through it all she endured, her rifle never wavering, her eyes never closing to fatigue. Harris, however, remained a storm barely restrained. His pride had been battered beyond repair, yet his nature would not let him accept his own failures. Where the others grew in quiet respect for her, he festered, his resentment twisting into something darker. He avoided her when he could, glared when he couldn't, his silence no longer a mask of professionalism but a cage rattling with fury. The officer saw it, the men saw it, and even she felt it pressing at the edges of every mission. They knew something would break, though none could predict when or how. That moment arrived on a mission that tested them in ways no drill could have prepared them for. The team was deployed into a valley where intelligence suggested an enemy convoy would be moving heavy weapons through rugged terrain. The task was to intercept, destroy, and exfiltrate before reinforcements could converge. The plan required precision and timing, a coordinated ambush that depended on discipline. They moved into position under the cloak of pre-dawn darkness, the air cold, the ground damp with dew. She found her perch high on a rocky outcrop, her scope sweeping the valley floor, while the rest of the team prepared charges along the narrow pass. Harris, assigned to lead one flank, bristled under the arrangement, his jaw tight as though every order grated against his skin. Hours passed in silence until the convoy appeared, trucks rumbling through the valley, headlights slicing the gloom. The team waited, breaths shallow, until the officer gave the signal. Explosions tore through the morning, the first trucks engulfed in fire, the enemy scrambling in confusion. Gunfire erupted, chaos spilling into the valley as the seals opened up from the ridges. She worked from her perch, her shots surgical, cutting down threats with unerring calm. But then Harris broke. Instead of holding position as ordered, he charged forward, reckless, anger blazing hotter than discipline. His men hesitated, caught between loyalty and survival, before following reluctantly. The enemy seized the gap instantly, redirecting their fire, pinning Harris's flank in the open. Through her scope she saw it unfold, Harris pinned behind a truck, his men falling back in panic, the enemy pressing hard. Without hesitation she shifted, her rifle cracking, each shot buying them seconds, carving a path through the chaos. She radioed for Harris to pull back, her voice steady, but he ignored it, shouting orders lost in the din of battle. She could see it clearly. His pride had driven him into disaster, and now his life and the lives of his men hung on a thread stretched by her precision. She adjusted, fired again and again, her calm holding back the tide until Harris and his battered group stumbled free of the kill zone. The officer's voice roared over comms, ordering a full retreat, and the team disengaged, slipping into the hills as the valley burned behind them. When they regrouped miles away, the atmosphere was thick with exhaustion and fury. The officer turned on Harris, his words sharp, his tone leaving no room for defense. Harris tried, sputtering excuses, blaming confusion, But the truth was plain to everyone. His recklessness had nearly cost them all. The men stood in silence, their eyes